There's no more time for tears. If I don't go, they will die. Ayana, the elderly widow, felt the 96 degrees cold tear at her aged skin, but it was the children's cries of hunger that chilled her soul. With trembling hands, she gripped the bow of her late husband as the relentless snow whipped her face. Before her, the silhouette of a mountain of flesh and fury, the legendary 5-ton buffalo, the last hope, the last obstacle. Her teary eyes fixed on the beast, knowing that every fiber of her being, every ounce of ancestral wisdom would be tested to its limit. And what happened next would dictate everyone's fate. Ayana did not avert her gaze from the colossal buffalo, an imposing mass of muscle and thick fur, exhaling steam into the frozen air. Her eyes, once welling with tears, now burned with a cold determination, mirroring the relentless landscape. It wasn't brute strength that would guide her. She knew that. Ayana, with her 70-odd winters, did not possess the agility of a young hunter, nor the strength to wield her husband's bow with the same dexterity as before. But she possessed something more valuable, the wisdom of generations, woven into every fiber of her being, a legacy of survival against nature itself. She felt the weight of the bow in her wrinkled hands, the same bow her beloved Beta had used to feed the village for so many years. A pang of longing pierced her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a warmth of purpose. Bator always said that the greatest hunter was not the strongest, but the most patient, the one who listened to the earth and the wind. Ayana took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs, and closed her eyes for an instant, seeking connection with Bator's memory, with the ancestral spirits dancing in the blizzards. In the village, the smoke from the hearths barely warmed their hearts. Inside the main tent, young Nara, with a pale face and chapped lips, tried to calm her small child who cried from hunger. Nara's breast milk was drying up, and each cry from the baby was a stab to her soul. She looked at the other faces around, all marked by exhaustion and despair. Old Semyon, the village shaman, sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the entrance, as if he could see Ayana through the storm. He knew that the village's hope rested on the elder's frail shoulders, an almost unbearable burden. Outside, Ayana opened her eyes. The buffalo grazed slowly, tearing frozen moss and lichen from the ground with its massive head. It was a creature of habit, and Ayana knew them. She remembered her father teaching her to read the tracks in the snow, to predict animal movements by the whisper of the wind. Every fiber of her being focused on observation. One false step, an untimely noise, and the buffalo could disappear into the white vastness, taking with it the village's last chance at life. Her gloved fingers fumbled in her quiver, feeling the sharp tip of an arrow. It would not be a direct confrontation hunt, but one of strategy, of patience. Ayana knew she needed to find the right moment, the weak point, the opportunity that nature might offer her. She began to circle the beast, maintaining a safe distance, her scrutinizing eyes studying every movement, every breath of the giant. The wind howled, trying to tear off her hood, but Ayana stood firm, a small silhouette of courage against the white immensity, moving with the calculated slowness of an experienced predator. The cold was excruciating, but the image of the children's hungry faces and their cries propelled her. Grandmother and matriarch, her love for her people was her strongest armor. Ayana watched the buffalo for hours. Her muscles protested, the ice seeped into her boots. She noticed a pattern in its grazing, a path slightly more covered in snow where the animal lingered longer. There perhaps was a chance, a small chink in nature's armor. Ayana moved with the patience of a mountain, her careful steps barely disturbing the virgin snow. The path the buffalo preferred was subtle, an almost imperceptible depression where the snow accumulated a little more, offering tenderer moss. She knew that every movement had to be calculated, every breath controlled. The frozen air scraped her throat, and her bones ached with a cold that seemed to penetrate to the marrow. But the image of Nara's hungry eyes, of her grandson's weak cry, was a fire that burned in her chest, stronger than winter itself. She remembered Beta, who once waited for a moose, still as an ice statue, before delivering the perfect strike. "Ayana," he had whispered, "nature teaches us the dance of waiting. He who dances best lives." In the village, hope dwindled like the embers of a forgotten fire. Nara, exhausted, rocked her baby, who now only whimpered softly, too weak to cry. Her own lips were chapped and bleeding. She looked at Semyon, standing at the tent's entrance, observing the veil of snow that covered the world. "Shaman," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "how much longer can we endure?" Semyon turned, his eyes heavy with the people's pain. He did not answer with words, but with a slow, sad nod. Ayana was their last prayer, and time was running out. He felt the weight of generations on his shoulders, the responsibility of maintaining faith. Outside, Ayana approached slowly, using the small undulations of the terrain and frozen bushes as cover. The buffalo, oblivious to the small figure, continued to graze, its breath forming dense clouds in the air. She noticed a tremor in its left hind leg, a sign of an old injury, a weakness. Ayana remembered an ancient lesson. Even a mountain has a weak point, if you know where to look. The elder felt her heart pound, a drum of life and death. It was a chance, minimal, but a chance. With fingers stiffened by the cold, she drew an arrow from her quiver. The polished bone tip gleamed dully under the faint light of the winter sun. She raised the bow, feeling the tension of the bowstring. Every muscle in her body protested, but Ayana ignored the pain. Her eyes, once tired, now shone with fierce concentration. She aimed, not at the animal's colossal mass, but at the exact spot that ancestral wisdom indicated to her, where the hide was thinnest, where the strike would be effective. The wind howled, trying to deflect her aim, but Ayana became an extension of the bow, one with the landscape, one with the will to survive. She drew the bowstring, feeling the wood creak slightly. The effort was immense for her aged arms, but the image of the hungry children gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. The arrow rested, ready. The buffalo raised its head for an instant, as if it sensed a disturbance in the air, its dark eyes sweeping the landscape. Ayana froze, motionless, her breath held. The beast snorted, a deep sound that echoed in the icy silence, and returned to grazing, seemingly satisfied. Ayana slowly exhaled, her heart pounding. She could not miss. There was no other arrow, no other chance. The life of her village depended on this single, desperate and precise strike. She waited, time stretching into a frozen eternity. The buffalo continued to graze, and Ayana watched, seeking the moment of the animal's complete relaxation, that instant of vulnerability that nature might grant. Her eyes didn't blink, fixed on the target. Ayana knew that true strength wasn't in felling the greatest enemy, but in finding the courage to face the impossible and the patience to wait for the right moment. Winter was a cruel master, but also a wise teacher. Winter was a cruel master, but also a wise teacher. Ayana felt every fiber of her body scream in protest against the cold and immobility, but Betor's voice resonated in her mind, an echo of patience and perseverance. She waited, her eyes welling not with sadness, but with the tension of a huntress. The buffalo finally lowered its head to tear at a particularly stubborn tuft of moss, exposing for a split second the vulnerable spot Ayana had studied. It was the moment. With an almost inaudible sigh, Ayana released the arrow. The sound of the vibrating bow broke the icy silence, a brief, sharp lament. The arrow, propelled by the strength of generations and the urgency of hunger, cut through the air with surprising speed for the hand that launched it. It flew straight true, a thread of hope against the white vastness. Ayana saw the bone tip disappear into the buffalo's thick fur, exactly where her instinct and ancestral wisdom had indicated. The colossus staggered. A deep, guttural grunt escaped its throat, a sound of surprise and contained fury that made the ground tremble beneath Ayana's feet. The buffalo raised its head, its dark eyes sweeping the landscape, searching for the source of the pain. It took a few clumsy steps, its immense body swaying like a mountain that had lost its balance. Ayana watched, her heart in her throat, her breath held. The beast snorted again, and then, with a moan that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, its legs gave way. The 5-ton buffalo fell heavily into the snow, an impact that echoed across the plain, raising a cloud of icy dust. Ayana felt relief flood her body, as overwhelming as the cold itself. Her knees buckled, but she refused to fall. In the village, the silence was almost palpable. Nara, with the baby asleep in her arms, felt the weight of hopelessness. The fire in the hearth dwindled, and with it the little energy left to its inhabitants. Semyon, the shaman, who had been in meditation, opened his eyes abruptly. A subtle, almost imperceptible vibration had traveled through the ground, a distant echo. He looked at the tent's entrance, where the snow continued to fall. A flash of something that seemed like hope, or perhaps just a premonition, crossed his wrinkled face. Nara watched him, her eyes questioning. Semyon merely shook his head slowly, a gesture that could mean both not yet and perhaps. Outside, Ayana approached the fallen buffalo, her steps slow and hesitant. The creature was even more imposing up close, a colossal mass of life that now lay motionless. A solitary tear ran down her wrinkled face, not from sadness for the beast, but from gratitude and the weight of responsibility. Ayana touched the animal's rough fur, feeling the warmth that still emanated from it. The challenge of hunting it had been overcome, but the real work was just beginning. How would an elderly woman, alone in the frozen vastness, move and process such a gigantic creature? Ayana looked at the grey sky, where clouds promised more snow. The task seemed impossible, but the image of her people's hungry faces and her grandson's cry gave her the strength to rise. She was not alone. The spirits of her ancestors and the love for her village guided her. Ayana looked at the mountain of meat, the 5-ton buffalo, and felt the weight of reality. How alone could she even begin to dismember and transport such a creature? Her muscles were already stiff, the cold penetrated every bone. A treacherous thought whispered of futility, but the image of Nara's and her grandson's hungry faces ignited a fire in her chest. There was no room for surrender. She remembered Beto's stories. The mind, not strength, overcame challenges. "Ayana," he would say, "nature gives us problems, but also the intelligence to solve them." She took a deep breath, the icy air cutting her throat. Moving the entire animal was impossible. She would have to slice it piece by piece and drag each part. Her tools were limited, just a hunting knife. She knelt in the snow, feeling the fur. She began to examine the anatomy, remembering lessons on butchering large game. Every cut would need to be strategic, preserving the meat and facilitating transport. The winter sun was already leaning west. Darkness would bring an even more intense cold. Time was her relentless enemy. In the village, the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint moans of the children. Nara, with the baby asleep in her arms, felt her body weak and her mind clouded. Her dull eyes fixed on the barely crackling fire, she wondered if Ayana had found the buffalo or if winter had swallowed her. Semyon, the shaman, sat near the entrance, murmuring prayers. He felt the village's energy draining away, hope a flickering flame, about to die out. Ayana began the arduous work. With the knife, she made the first cuts, feeling the resistance of the frozen hide and muscles. Every movement required a strength she barely possessed, and her fingers stiffened. She stopped to warm her hands, warding off the numbness. The smell of blood mingled with the icy air, a reminder of the harsh necessity. She needed an ingenious solution. The village was far. No one had the strength to come. She looked at the vast white horizon. The ancestral spirits, Beta's voice, her grandson's cry, all formed an invisible force. She remembered a technique for moving large loads, using the snow as a ramp and with strong branches, creating an improvised sled. With renewed determination, Ayana began to gather dry, strong branches under the snow, creating a rudimentary platform. She piled compacted snow, forming a ramp beside the buffalo. It was slow, exhausting work. Her lips were chapped, her skin wind-burned, but her eyes maintained the glow of resilience. She wasn't just saving her village, she was honoring Bator's memory. The true hunt didn't end with the fall of the prey, but with the food safely in the village. She continued, cut by cut, branch by branch, against the fury of winter. Ayana felt the tendons in her arms burn. Every cut into the buffalo's thick hide was a battle. The knife, sharp as winter's tongue, slid with difficulty through the frozen muscles. Her fingers, numb despite her gloves, could barely hold the handle. The sun had already completely hidden itself, and the darkness of the deepest Yakutian night descended like a heavy cloak, bringing with it an even more biting cold, promising temperatures below the already unbearable 96-degree Fahrenheit. The wind howled, a ghostly lament that seemed to mock her small figure against the immensity of the plain. She stopped every few minutes, bringing her hands to her chapped lips and blowing warm breath, a futile attempt to ward off the numbness that threatened to steal her dexterity. In the village, the flame of hope flickered dangerously. Nara, with the baby in her arms, felt her body growing weaker. The little one, who once cried with vigor, now only whimpered softly, a sound that broke the mother's heart. "He's so cold, Semyon," Nara whispered, her voice almost inaudible, her eyes fixed on the shaman. Semyon, his face marked by worry, lit another piece of wood in the fire, watching the embers dwindle. He felt the village's life draining away. Every second of waiting was an eternity of anguish. "Ayana is strong, Nara. The spirits guide her." He tried to console, but his own words sounded hollow amidst the growing despair. He knew that faith was all they had left. Outside, Ayana, with the wisdom of one who knows the land and its secrets, focused on the task. She had managed to separate one of the buffalo's forelegs, a considerable portion of meat and bone. It was progress, but the leg alone weighed more than she could drag for long. The idea of the improvised sled took shape in her mind. She could not afford to give up. Ayana began to pile the dry branches she had collected, forming a base under the separated leg. Then, with her bare hands, she began to compact the snow around it, molding it to create a smooth, slippery surface which would serve as a kind of ramp and track for the sled. The work was slow, painful, and solitary. Every branch broke under her hands. Every handful of snow froze her fingers to insensibility. But Ayana remembered Bator's words, who said that true strength wasn't in muscles, but in the persistence of the spirit. "Ayana, winter tries to break us, but we are made of the same rocket calves." She felt Bata's presence beside her, an invisible warmth that propelled her. With every piece of compacted snow, with every branch positioned, she visualized the children's faces, Nara's smile, Semyon's gratitude. The elder knew that the night would be long and cruel. She needed to make as much progress as possible before the cold became completely paralyzing. She continued to work, her movements methodical and determined, despite the exhaustion. The buffalo's leg was now on the platform of branches, partially covered by the compacted snow. It was a start. A small piece of the colossus was ready to be moved. Ayana looked at the starry sky where the northern lights danced, a spectacle of lights that, in other circumstances, would bring awe. But now, it was just a reminder of the relentless vastness of the world and her insignificance before it. Still, she did not feel small. She felt like a bridge between life and death, between hope and despair, and she would not allow that bridge to crumble. Winter was a cruel master, but also a wise teacher. Ayana felt every fiber of her body scream in protest against the cold and immobility. But Beta's voice resonated in her mind, an echo of patience and perseverance. She waited, her eyes welling not with sadness, but with the tension of a huntress. The buffalo, finally, lowered its head to tear at a particularly stubborn tuft of moss, exposing for a split second the vulnerable spot Ayana had studied. It was the moment. With an almost inaudible sigh, Ayana released the arrow. The sound of the vibrating bow broke the icy silence, a brief, sharp lament. The arrow, propelled by the strength of generations and the urgency of hunger, cut through the air with surprising speed for the hand that launched it. It flew straight, true, a thread of hope against the white vastness. Ayana saw the bone tip disappear into the buffalo's thick fur, exactly where her instinct and ancestral wisdom had indicated. The colossus staggered. A deep guttural grunt escaped its throat, a sound of surprise and contained fury that made the ground tremble beneath Ayana's feet. The buffalo raised its head, its dark eyes sweeping the landscape, searching for the source of the pain. It took a few clumsy steps, its immense body swaying, like a mountain that had lost its balance. Ayana watched, her heart in her throat, her breath held. The beast snorted again, and then, with a moan that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, its legs gave way. The 5-ton buffalo fell heavily into the snow, an impact that echoed across the plain, raising a cloud of icy dust. Ayana felt relief flood her body, as overwhelming as the cold itself. Her knees buckled, but she refused to fall. In the village, the silence was almost palpable. Nara, with the baby asleep in her arms, felt the weight of hopelessness. The fire in the hearth dwindled, and with it, the little energy left to its inhabitants. Semyon, the shaman, who had been in meditation, opened his eyes abruptly. A subtle, almost imperceptible vibration had traveled through the ground, a distant echo. He looked at the tent's entrance, where the snow continued to fall. A flash of something that seemed like hope, or perhaps just a premonition, crossed his wrinkled face. Nara watched him, her eyes questioning. Semyon merely shook his head slowly, a gesture that could mean both not yet and perhaps. Outside, Ayana approached the fallen buffalo, her steps slow and hesitant. The creature was even more imposing up close, a colossal mass of life that now lay motionless. A solitary tear ran down her wrinkled face, not from sadness for the beast, but from gratitude and the weight of responsibility. Ayana touched the animal's rough fur, feeling the warmth that still emanated from it. The challenge of hunting it had been overcome, but the real work was just beginning. How would an elderly woman, alone in the frozen vastness, move and process such a gigantic creature? Ayana looked at the grey sky, where clouds promised more snow. The task seemed impossible, but the image of her people's hungry faces and her grandson's cry gave her the strength to rise. She was not alone. The spirits of her ancestors and the love for her village guided her. Ayana looked at the buffalo's leg, now partially secured on the platform of branches and snow. It was a start, yes, but the sight of the rest of the colossal carcass, stretched out in the growing darkness, was an overwhelming reminder of the mountain she still needed to move. Her shoulders ached with tension, and the cold seemed to have nested in her bones, sucking away any remaining warmth. The wind, now stronger and more merciless, whipped the loose snow, forming small whirlwinds that danced around her, like mocking spirits. She felt the tips of her toes go numb inside her boots, a dangerous sign of approaching frostbite. In the village, the situation was increasingly desperate. Nara, with the baby in her arms, tried to warm him with her own body, but her warmth was fading. The little one sobbed at irregular intervals, his lips purplish. Semyon, observing the fire that was now just a handful of stubborn embers, felt the weight of helplessness. He had tried all his prayers, all his rituals, but winter seemed deaf to his pleas. His eyes, once full of ancestral wisdom, now reflected a deep sadness. "The spirits are silent," he murmured, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to Nara. She merely clutched the baby to her chest, a solitary tear running down her thin face. Outside, Ayana, ignoring the stabbing pain in her joints, picked up the knife again. The next step was to separate another part of the buffalo. She knew she needed more meat to justify the journey, so that her sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. With a monumental effort, she began to make a new cut, this time in the loin section, where the meat was more abundant and valuable. The blade scraped against the bones, and the sound, muffled by the wind, was almost inaudible, but the effort was immense. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest, but the image of Nara's hungry eyes and her grandson's weak cry was a whip that propelled her. She remembered Beitor, who said, "Ayana, the body may falter, but the spirit must never bend." She worked for hours that dragged like centuries. The loin, finally separated, was a huge and heavy piece. Ayana dragged it with difficulty to the improvised platform, which was already beginning to sag under the weight. She needed to reinforce it. With trembling hands, she searched for more branches, breaking them with the strength of her will, more than her muscles. The snow now fell denser, further obscuring the already weak visibility. The world became a white and grey canvas, and Ayana a dark smudge of determination. In the village, Nara's baby's small body trembled uncontrollably. The high fever and relentless cold were taking their toll. Nara, in despair, tried to feed him some melted snow, but he could barely swallow. "Semyon, he is fading," she sobbed, her voice broken. The shaman approached, his eyes fixed on the child. He touched the baby's forehead, feeling the feverish heat. A deep wrinkle formed on his brow. He knew that time was running out, not just for the baby, but for all of them. Ayana was their only hope, but the distance and the fury of winter made her return a mirage. Ayana, oblivious to her village's suffering, yet driven by it, continued her struggle. She had managed to secure the loin next to the leg, using strips of hide she had brought to tie the pieces to the branches. The rudimentary sled was heavy, but seemed stable. She knew she couldn't take the entire buffalo, but those 2 pieces would be enough to feed the village for days, perhaps weeks. Exhaustion was almost total, but a new type of strength, born of pure necessity, propelled her. She looked at the pieces of meat, a trophy of her resilience. The sun would soon rise, bringing a brief respite, but also the reminder that she needed to begin the long journey back. Ayana felt a pang of hope, a faint but persistently burning flame in her frozen heart. The village awaited, and she would not fail. Ayana, with the last strip of hide firmly tied, gave the improvised sled an experimental tug. The weight was overwhelming. The 2 pieces of buffalo meat, the leg and the loin, formed a dark mountain on the branches, sinking into the soft snow. Her muscles, already exhausted from the hunt and dismemberment, protested with a sharp pain that spread across her back and shoulders. The icy air burned in her lungs. The darkness of the deepest Yakutian night persisted, the stars twinkling indifferently in the sky, like distant eyes watching without judgment. The northern lights had faded, leaving an icy and oppressive void. She knew that the journey back would be the hardest part. The distance to the village seemed insurmountable, and the sled, however rudimentary, would require a strength she no longer had. But the image of Nara's pale face and her grandson's weak cry was a tireless engine, a silent promise that kept her from giving in. Ayana tied a thick rope made of sinew fibers to the sled and passed the other end over her shoulder, crossing it over her chest. It would be painful, but the load needed to be distributed. With a groan of effort, she leaned forward, forcing her feet into the snow for traction. The sled moved, an inch, perhaps two. The sound of wood and snow dragging was a solitary echo in the silent vastness, which seemed to absorb any trace of sound. Ayana took another step, and then another. Every movement was a battle against gravity, friction, and exhaustion itself. Drops of cold sweat ran down her forehead, freezing into small crystals as they touched her skin. Her eyes, once fixed on the horizon, now focused only on the next steps, the next breath. Ayana's mind emptied of everything except the visceral need to move forward, a primal instinct of survival. In the village, the flame of life was almost extinguished. Nara's baby, wrapped in furs, trembled convulsively, his tiny lips blue and his breath shallow, almost imperceptible. Nara, lying beside him, no longer had the strength to cry. Her eyes were dry, fixed on the tent's ceiling, where the smoke from the dying fire accumulated. Hunger and cold had stolen her voice, her energy, and even the last spark of hope. She just held her son's icy little hand, feeling his weak pulse. Semyon, the shaman, hunched in front of the fire, no longer murmured prayers. He merely watched the last embers die out. The silence of the tent was interrupted only by the occasional moans of the children and the sound of the wind howling outside, which seemed to mock the fragility of life. He felt death approaching, an icy and inevitable embrace that threatened to swallow them all. Ayana, the last hope, seemed swallowed by the white immensity. Semyon closed his eyes, a tear running down his wrinkled face. Not for himself, but for the innocent souls lost in that cruel winter. Outside, Ayana continued her agonizing march. She had covered only a few dozen yards, but it felt like an eternity. The sled, heavy and stubborn, often sank into the deep snow, requiring her to stop, adjust the load, and restart the Herculean effort. Her knees ached, her ankles were swollen, but she refused to stop. "For my grandson," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "for my village." With each step, she felt Beta's presence, not as a ghost, but as a force that propelled her, a memory of love and resilience. He had taught her that the true hunt was not just felling the prey, but bringing life back home to those who waited. Ayana looked at the sky. A slight change in the grey tone announced the arrival of dawn. A new hope, faint as the flame of a candle flickering in the wind, ignited in her chest. The sun, even if weak and distant, would bring a little warmth and visibility. She needed to hold on until then. The village depended on her. Ayana tightened the rope, feeling the pain that was a constant and poignant reminder of her mission. She was the bridge, and she would not bend. Ayana tightened the rope, feeling the pain that was a constant and poignant reminder of her mission. She was the bridge, and she would not bend. Dawn arrived, not with the golden explosion of summer, but with a slow grey transition, where the deep blue of night diluted into a pale white, almost without promise of warmth. The faint light revealed the relentless vastness of the plain, stretching in all directions, and the sled, now more visible, seemed even more insignificant against the immensity. Ayana had covered a few more yards, but each one had been torture. The sled repeatedly sank into the softer snow, and the effort to dig it out and push it required increasingly frequent pauses. Her muscles trembled uncontrollably, and her breath came out in dense clouds, each exhalation a silent groan. The tips of her toes were numb, and she knew that frostbite was a real threat. Ayana stopped, hunched over the rope, her eyes closed for an instant. Exhaustion was a heavy veil that threatened to swallow her. A treacherous thought, like the icy wind, whispered that it was useless, that she should just lie down in the snow and rest. But the image of Nara's pale face, of her grandson's small, trembling body, ignited a spark of fury and determination within her. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I will not fail." She opened her eyes, seeking a solution. The sled, with its improvised branches, was not supporting the weight evenly. One of the hide straps holding the loin had loosened, and the meat was slipping, unbalancing the load. If she continued like this, the sled would disintegrate. Ayana knew she needed more than strength. She needed cunning. She remembered Bator, who in his stories always emphasized the importance of observing and adapting. "Ayana," he would say, "the snow is your enemy, but it can also be your ally." She looked at the ground, at the compacted snow beneath her feet, and at the softer snow around her. An idea began to form. In the village, dawn brought an even deeper silence. Nara's baby no longer trembled. His breath was almost non-existent, and his lips were an alarming bluish purple. Nara, with glazed eyes, felt the weak pulse in his tiny hand, a tenuous thread that could break at any moment. She did not cry, did not speak. She merely watched, a statue of despair. Semyon, the shaman, slowly rose. He had felt the change, a strange stillness in the air, an absence that chilled the soul more than winter itself. He approached Nara and the baby, his wrinkled eyes filled with deep sadness. He touched the little one's forehead, and the feverish heat had given way to a terrifying cold. The shaman closed his eyes, and a silent lament escaped his lips. The hope, which he had tried to keep alive, seemed to have completely extinguished. He felt the village's life draining away, like the smoke from a dying fire. Outside, Ayana, with a clear mind, despite the exhaustion, began to work again. She untied the rope from the sled, and with her knife cut new, wider and stronger strips of buffalo hide. Instead of just tying the meat to the branches, she began to wrap the pieces of meat with the strips, creating more compact and secure bundles. Then, with a Herculean effort, she pushed the loin and the leg closer to each other, trying to balance the weight. She then used the soft snow around to create a wider bed for the sled, compacting it with her hands and feet, forming a more stable and even more slippery base. It was meticulous and slow work, but Ayana knew it was the only way. She could not afford to rush and lose the load. Every movement was a prayer, every effort an act of pure love. She felt the pale sun touch her face, but the warmth was just an illusion. Ayana, however, felt a different warmth, an internal warmth that came from the certainty that she was doing everything she could. The village awaited, and she would continue to fight step by step against the fury of winter. Ayana, with the new, firmer hide straps and the compacted snow base, gave the sled a cautious tug. This time, the dragging was smoother, a less harsh sound against the silent vastness. It wasn't easy, far from it. Every inch required a strength that seemed to come from a hidden reserve, but the progress, though minimal, was undeniable. She felt the buffalo's weight, not only on her shoulders and back, but also in her spirit, a sacred burden she carried for everyone. The pale sun barely managed to pierce the dense layer of clouds, but the faint light was enough to guide her steps. Ayana focused on a distant point on the horizon, an imaginary place where the village awaited her. She visualized the tents, the lit fire, the faces of her people, no longer pale with hunger but warmed by hope. Her fingers, though numb, could still hold the rope firmly. She breathed deeply, the icy air burning in her lungs, but the physical pain was a reminder that she was alive, that she could still fight. Every step was a victory, every pull a silent prayer. Ayana remembered how Bator had taught her to track, to read nature's signs, to adapt. Now she applied that same wisdom to her own journey, transforming the snow, her enemy, into an ally for transport. The sled, once a clumsy heap, now slid with surprising efficiency for its improvised construction. In the village, the scene was one of agonizing stillness. Nara, with her eyes fixed on the baby, noticed that the little one had stopped trembling. It was not a good sign. His skin was cold to the touch, and his breath, once almost imperceptible, now seemed to have ceased completely for a few seconds, before returning in a weak, irregular gasp. A lump tightened in Nara's throat, and she brought her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Semyon, who watched the scene with deep pain in his gaze, gently touched her shoulder. Their eyes met, and in the silence, the message was clear. The little one's life hung by a thread. He knelt beside Nara, and together they watched the baby, their expressions reflecting a mixture of despair and a last stubborn hope. Semyon, with a slow gesture, took the baby's tiny hand and rubbed it between his own, trying to infuse some warmth. He murmured ancient words, invocations to the spirits of earth and sky, not with the strength of before, but with the fragility of one who pleads. Nara, seeing the shaman's effort, felt a pang of guilt for her own lack of faith. She leaned in and kissed her son's icy forehead, a solitary tear running down her face. "Please, my little one," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Hold on." Outside, Ayana felt a slight change in the wind. It seemed to have diminished a little, a small relief she welcomed with gratitude. She had covered a considerable distance since dawn, and the village, though still invisible, seemed a little less distant in her mind. The exhaustion was immense, but the idea of giving up was a thought she simply did not allow. She was the guardian of hope, the bridge between life and death for her people. Ayana stopped for a moment, turning to look at the sled. The pieces of meat were secure, firm. A faint smile of pure satisfaction and exhaustion touched her wrinkled lips. She had succeeded. The meticulous work had paid off. With renewed vigor, Ayana adjusted the rope over her shoulder. Her eyes shone with renewed determination. She was not just dragging meat. She was dragging life, hope, the future of her village. Winter could be brutal, but the human spirit, forged in adversity, was even stronger. She took another step and then another, her movements slow but constant, a silent melody of resilience in the vast symphony of ice. Ayana knew that every step brought her closer to home, closer to her grandson, closer to salvation. The sun, now a pale, distant disk in the sky, began to lean west, announcing the brief twilight. Ayana felt a shiver that didn't come from the cold, but from a growing urgency. The village should be near, but the icy mist rising from the ground obscured her vision, transforming distances into a white and treacherous veil. Her feet were numb, and her legs felt like lead. She stumbled, the rope slipping from her shoulder for an instant, and the sled stopped with a jolt, sinking again into the deeper snow. Ayana fell to her knees, exhaustion finally overcoming her. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and a groan escaped her lips. The treacherous voice in her mind returned, stronger now, whispering of the warmth of eternal rest, of the futility of her struggle. She closed her eyes, feeling the tears freeze on her eyelids. In the village, Nara's baby stopped breathing. There was no cry, no scream, just a terrifying silence that filled the tent. Nara clutched her son to her chest, feeling his body grow cold, life draining away. Her eyes, once fixed on the child, now rose to Semyon, filled with unspeakable pain, with an emptiness that seemed to swallow the world. The shaman, who still held the baby's tiny hand, felt the last pulse disappear. He closed his eyes, his head bowed, and a deep, hoarse lament escaped his throat, a sound of despair that echoed in the tent. The other villagers who watched in silence lowered their heads, hope dying in their hearts. Winter had won. Outside, Ayana, still on her knees, felt a sudden warmth in her chest, a sharp pang of sadness and a renewed fury. It was as if Semyon's lament, Nara's pain, had reached her through the wind and snow. She could not see, but she felt. She felt that time was running out, that her grandson's life hung by a thread, or perhaps had already broken. This perception, painful and overwhelming, acted like an electric shock. "No!" she cried, her voice hoarse, rising with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere else. Her eyes, once blurred by exhaustion, now shone with a fierce light. She could not give up, not now, not when she was so close. She remembered Bator, his smile, his strength. "Ayana, you are stronger than you think." She looked ahead, into the mist. There was a small rise, a snow dune she hadn't noticed before. If she could climb there, perhaps she could see the village. With a cry of effort, Ayana leaned over the rope, pulling the sled with desperate strength. Her muscles screamed, but she ignored them. Every step was a prayer, a promise. She climbed the dune, the soft snow making every movement difficult, but she did not stop. When she reached the top, the wind whipped her face, clearing the mist for an instant. And there it was, the faint lights of the tents, the thin smoke from the fires, Ayana's village, less than 100 yards away. A wave of relief and dread washed over her. She was home. But would it be too late? With the last remaining strength, Ayana gave a final pull, the sled sliding down the dune slope towards the village. Ayana felt the sled slide down the dune slope, gaining momentum that dragged her forward, almost knocking her down. Her feet could barely keep up, but she did not let go of the rope. The icy air whipped her face, but the smell of the fire's smoke, now denser, was a balm to her soul. The tents, once mere silhouettes, began to take shape, and she could distinguish the outlines of the hides and poles. A low, hesitant murmur began to spread among the few villagers who were outside, sweeping snow or tending the last embers. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, fixed on Ayana's stumbling figure, and even more so, on the dark mountain she dragged. The sled stopped abruptly at the village entrance, the buffalo's weight finally yielding to the friction of the denser, trampled snow. Ayana let go of the rope, her hands raw, and fell to her knees, her body trembling uncontrollably. She no longer had the strength to stand. Her eyes, however, scanned the pale, gaunt faces that approached, a mixture of disbelief and a spark of hope beginning to glow in their empty gazes. Semyon, who had emerged from Nara's tent, sensing the commotion, stopped at the threshold, his wrinkled eyes widening as he saw Ayana and the colossus of meat. For a moment he thought it was a mirage, an illusion created by hunger and despair. But the strong smell of meat, the steam still emanating from the buffalo's frozen hide, was undeniable. A solitary tear ran down his face, and he murmured, his voice choked, "Ayana, you did it." Nara, hearing the buzz and Semyon's muffled cry, came out of the tent, the baby still nestled in her arms, wrapped in furs. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying so much, found her grandmother kneeling in the snow. The pain in her chest was so deep she could barely breathe, but the sight of that gigantic animal, of the promise of life, made her heart leap. She ran to Ayana, falling beside her, and hugged her tightly, warm tears streaming down the elder's face. "Grandma! Grandma!" Nara sobbed, her voice mixed with relief and gratitude. Ayana, feeling her granddaughter's embrace, the voice of her own blood, felt a wave of warmth spread through her exhausted body. She raised her trembling hand and touched Nara's face. Her eyes sought the small bundle of furs in her granddaughter's arms. "The baby, my grandson," she whispered, her voice hoarse and almost inaudible. Semyon approached, his expression still heavy with sadness, but with a new glimmer of hope in his eyes. He knelt beside Nara and Ayana. He's still with us, Ayana," Semyon said, his voice firmer than before. "But the thread is tenuous. As the villagers, now in a frenzy of activity and relief, began to organize to unload the buffalo meat, the smell of life and the promise of food flooded the village. They removed the hides, sharp knives gleaming in the pale twilight, and began to cut pieces from the colossus, the red meat contrasting with the white snow. The sound of the cuts, once unthinkable, was a melody of salvation. Nara, with hope renewed by Ayana's presence and the promise of food, looked at the baby in her arms. She clutched him tighter, feeling the warmth of her grandmother's body beside her. Suddenly, an almost imperceptible movement. A sigh, stronger this time, and a small but definite twitch in the baby's tiny hand. It wasn't a cry, it wasn't a scream, but it was life. It was proof that the little warrior still fought. Nara's eyes widened, a cry of surprise and contained joy escaping her lips. "Semyon, Grandma, he moved, he breathed." Ayana, who had her head bowed, lifted it abruptly, her eyes fixed on her grandson. She saw the small hand move, felt the weak but present breath. A tear, warm and salty, ran down her wrinkled cheek, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it almost crushed her. The 5-ton burden had been carried, and the reward was life. Winter had not won. The village, her people, her grandson, all would have a new chance. Ayana, exhausted and broken, felt a renewed strength, the strength of love and triumph that had propelled her journey. She had fulfilled her promise. Ayana, her heart still beating erratically, saw her grandson's tiny hand move again, a minimal gesture, but one that resonated like thunder in her exhausted soul. Nara, with tears of pure joy streaming down her face, hugged the baby with renewed strength, kissing his pale forehead. "He's alive, Grandma! He's alive!" she whispered, her voice choked, lifting the little one so Ayana could see him up close. Semyon, with a faint smile and teary eyes, touched Ayana's shoulder. "The spirits heard, Ayana. Your faith and your strength brought life back." The village, once plunged into a funereal silence, now buzzed with contagious energy. The men with sharp knives and agile hands had already begun to cut the buffalo meat, distributing the pieces to the fires that crackled with a long-forgotten intensity. The smell of fresh meat and smoke filled the air, an aroma of hope that warmed hearts and empty stomachs. The women, their eyes gleaming, prepared the cauldrons, while the children, once apathetic, now watched with hungry curiosity, their small faces illuminated by the fire's reflection. Ayana, helped by Nara, was led to her tent. Her muscles screamed in protest, and every step was agony. But the sight of her grandson breathing, of the fire's warmth and the village's activity, was a balm for her pain. She sat on her fur bed, and Nara, with tender care, removed her frozen boots and massaged her numb feet. "Rest, Grandma," Nara said, her voice soft. "You saved us all." Ayana merely nodded, her eyes heavy, but a smile of peace spreading across her wrinkled lips. She felt the warmth of the fire Nara had lit in her tent, and exhaustion dragged her into a deep sleep where she dreamed of Beitor, smiling, and of the vast snow-covered plains, now no longer a place of despair, but of triumph. In the days that followed, Ayana's village was reborn. The buffalo meat, abundant and nutritious, brought color back to pale faces and strength to weakened bodies. Nara's baby, fed with rich broths and wrapped in warm furs, began to regain weight, his small cries, now signs of life and hunger, not weakness. The children returned to playing in the snow, their laughter echoing through the village, a sound that had been silenced by winter. The men, with renewed energy, began to repair the tents and plan the next hunts, knowing that winter was not yet over, but that they had the strength to face it. Ayana, though still frail, watched everything with a heart full of gratitude. She was no longer just the elder, she was the guardian of life, the heroine who had defied fate and won. Her name would be whispered with reverence around the fires for many generations, a living legend of Yakutian resilience. Women sought her for advice, men to share their concerns, and children to hear the stories of the 5-ton buffalo hunt, a story that would become part of the fabric of their culture. One day, as the pale sun finally gained a little more strength, melting the edges of the snow, Ayana sat at the entrance of her tent, watching her grandson, now stronger, play with a piece of hide. Nara sat beside her, holding her hand. "We will never forget what you did, Grandma," she said, her eyes full of love. Ayana smiled, a smile that reached her wrinkled eyes. "It wasn't just me, my daughter. It was the hope that never dies, the love that unites us, the strength that resides in each of us." She looked at the horizon, where the ice began to yield. The most brutal winter had been overcome. Life, in its purest and most resilient form, had found a way, and Ayana knew that, as long as there was love and courage, her people would always find the light, even in the deepest darkness. Ayana knew that, as long as there was love and courage, her people would always find the light, even in the deepest darkness. With spring, the snow melted into streams, revealing the dormant earth. The village, once pale, pulsed with vitality. Hides of the 5-ton buffalo became cloaks, the dried meat ensured subsistence. The brutal winter left scars, but also resilience and unity. Ayana's grandson, rosy and curious, crawled through the tent, laughter replacing hunger's whimpers. Nara watched him with love, gratitude for mother and child etched on her face. She sat with Ayana, learning to cure hides. Herbs and stories, Ayana gently imparted ancestral wisdom and the essence of her journey. Semyon, the shaman, had regained his glow. He spent hours with Ayana, exchanging words about spirits, human strength, and nature. Ayana was not just the elder, she was the bridge between past and future, the personification of courage. Children gathered, asking for the buffalo story. Eyes wide as she described the wind and the meat, she concluded, "It was not the strength of my arms, but the strength of our love that guided me. The true hunt is that of hope." Ayana, at the tent's entrance, watched the spring sun. Men worked, women wove, children ran, their voices joyful. She felt the breeze on her wrinkled face, a contrast to the icy whip. The physical pain had diminished, replaced by peace and purpose. She thought of Beitor, feeling his presence as comforting warmth, part of her strength. Pride in him. Hunger had forged a new sense of community. They learned that, in the darkest moments, unity and faith were the strongest shields. Shared provisions, strengthened family bonds, each dawn met with gratitude. Ayana had shown that hope was not a luxury, but a necessity, an inner fire to be fed. One day, Nara, helping Ayana with some tea, asked, "Grandma, weren't you afraid?" Ayana smiled, her eyes on the horizon. "Fear is a shadow, my daughter. It tries to paralyze. But love is the sun that dispels it. I was afraid for the village, yes, but my love for you all was greater." Nara squeezed her grandmother's hand, understanding. Ayana stood up, her steps firm. She walked to the center of the village, where a ceremonial fire crackled. Villagers followed her, looks of respect. She raised her hands to the sky, her voice soft, but with the authority of one who faced death and brought life. "May the memory of this winter strengthen us. May ancestral wisdom guide us. May love among us be a warmth that never fades." Murmurs of agreement spread. The sun set, painting the sky over the snowy mountains. Ayana knew that new winters would come, but her people would always be ready. They had the story of the 5-ton buffalo, the legend of Ayana, to remember that true strength lay not in the absence of challenges, but in the courage to face them, in the resilience of a heart that refused to give up. Ayana's village, more than ever, was a beacon of hope in vast Yakutia, a living testament to the indomitable human spirit.